Alan, I like how your April article pointed out all the times that our NATO allies have been there for us, from 9/11 to the Iraq and Afghanistan wars and the war on ISIS, as well as the current Red Sea war with Houthi. So let's
Right.
talk more about why the U.S. is better off with NATO and our allies and what obstacles we're facing. Welcome back to our listeners and back to our Peace Through Strength podcast brought to you by the American Security Council Foundation. I'm your host, Votrobek, and back with me is our senior fellow, Alan Dowd. Back, Alan.
Good to be here, as always.
And we're going to touch on Alan's April article titled The Core of America's Security. Find all of Alan's articles on our website at www.ascf.us. Please sign up for our newsletter and consider donating so we can bring you public awareness of U.S. global leadership. New Cold War 2.0, as Alan likes to state. China. Alan, you and I have constantly harped on why our allies and NATO are so important to our security and our economy. So do you believe under the Trump administration, threats to NATO and our allies are a lot of rhetoric, or is this a serious concern of a more isolated America?
I think from our allies' perspective, it is a serious concern. They don't see it as just rhetoric. And as that article you referenced, my April column, that kind of delineates some of the things. They're not just words, as you know. It's more than words. It's more than rhetoric. There's been real actions and policy pronouncements sometimes go together, but sometimes they're distinct. But this time they're going together and they're both pointing toward, as you use the term, the I word, toward a more isolationist United States. And that is frightening, I think, many of our NATO allies, rattling all of them. And I would suspect, and I don't know if it's even the right verb, suspect, I think it's uh, very welcome to our Russian enemies, some of the policies and some of the words that are coming out of the White House. You know, the title of that article, I borrow, as the readers who've seen the column, I borrow from President Reagan. He said NATO was the core, the very core of America's security. Uh, a lot has happened since he said that in the mid 1980s, but much remains the same. Our allies in Europe really are the beginning, the kind of the right in the middle of our security framework for the world. It really begins with our transatlantic link. Uh, Reagan had the foresight, even at the end of the Cold War, to say we should expand NATO, even after the Soviet Union was reforming, and even after the Soviet Union was gone. He talked about expanding NATO as a hedge, insurance policy. So I think it's more than rhetoric. I don't think our allies are overreacting, and I think it's a concern to many of us who see that the Reagan view of American foreign policy and national security is proven and works.
Yes, I mean, we definitely world on our own, I would say.
That's
And
correct.
as we've discussed, our allies also are very essential to our economy.
Right. I'm glad you mentioned that. You know, in a sense, we're given a choice, or we're at a fork in the road, and we come to this fork in the road uh, frequently. Uh, do we want to uh, maintain some semblance of order around the world because we recognized or remember what happened when we withdrew from the world? And if we want to do that, we're going to need help. We cannot do it alone.
Mm-hmm.
And NATO is the beginning of that. NATO is the core of that, as Reagan said. Or the other side of the fork in the road is, do we want to just withdraw and create Fortress America, turn inward? If we choose that option, history is pretty clear what happens when we do that. And Reagan would counsel, don't go down that path again. Work with allies, lead for sure. America needs to lead. Our allies want us to lead, but be engaged in the world, because when we disengage, bad things happen.
Yeah, I mean, engaged after World War One, and
Exactly.
what happened?
That's right, and even more than that, we disengaged after World War One. In a sense, in a very real sense, we disengaged after World War Two. If the history shows, it was very brief, but the Soviet bloc made the most out of a period of what we could call the first peace dividend. We were pulling back from Europe, drawing defensive perimeters in the Pacific, and Stalin gives a green light to the invasion of South Korea. Before that, he tries to muscle us out of West Berlin, and that was because America was pulling back quickly. To his credit, Truman said, "We can't do that. We have to remember the lessons that we're starting to forget." And he reversed course, and in bipartisan fashion, built a consensus around American engagement and American leadership around the world. Which, by the way, NATO was born in 1949, and more than half of the countries that sent troops to help us in Korea, by the way, were NATO allies. So NATO's been helping America advance American interests, coincide with international security, at least since 1949 when NATO was born.
And I think that would make a good point to making America great again is, yes, I'm all for it, but it requires allies as well.
That's right. This is not an either or situation. It's so well said, Joy. It's a great point. I wish I had made it in the column, but it's not an either or situation. America, and to make America great again, or to keep America great, I don't think it was not great, before President Trump became a president again. But to do that, we need NATO allies. It's not an either or situation. I love what General Mattis said in 2018. I think I quoted in that column. If we didn't have NATO today, we would need to create it. And there's so much truth to that, because we need partners who share our values, share our vision, share our interests to advance the free world, to defend the free world. We really can't do it alone. I think we've actually seen some glimpses of what it might look like if we try to do it alone over the last few weeks.
Yeah, that's very true. And it's been really part of our peace strength. U.S. global leadership is one principle that requires force for peace. And
Yes,
we've
all
got
those go
two
together.
democracies
Exactly.
kind of hanging in the bound there between. We talked last time on Ukraine and Taiwan. I mean,
That's right. Those things go together. I'm glad you put them together. Reagan certainly thought they went together. He didn't put them in different buckets or boxes. Interests and ideals do go together. Our part of our interests are includes advancing the idea of free government, free trade, free enterprise around the world. That also happens to be tied up with or knitted together inside America's values. The great thing is the free world is bigger than it used to be, largely because America helped grow the free world and defend the free world during the Cold War, and then in that post-Cold War era of the 1990s and into the early 2000s, we, the United States, helped grow the free world. So free world's bigger, stronger, and more, I think, capable to deal with what I call the axis of autocrats than certainly at the beginning of the Cold War. And why would we not work with our free world allies? Why would we not use that asset or that tool in the toolbox to help our interests, which are also coincide with our allies in Europe and the Indo-Pacific and Americas and elsewhere?
yes, and bringing up our allies and what we mentioned at the beginning there, the Red Sea. So I read your linked article on the Red Sea, and I thought it was very interesting, and I stand corrected because I thought really it was just the UK helping us there against the Houthis. But in your article, you said there was 9 other nations under the Biden administration that were working with us. And then you mentioned February, well, not you, but in the article mentioned in February that now other nations have kind of pulled back. They don't want to be under, they're unwilling to become under U.S. command. So it looks like the UN leading their own way again.
Correct. And I don't know if we can ascribe that to Trump policies or not. As your listeners know, as ASCF members know, the French like to be independent. That predates President Trump. President Reagan uh, dealt with the French wanting to be independent at times, and that can sometimes frustrate. But in the case of the Red Sea, the fact that it's an EU flotilla or an EU mission working alongside a U.S. led mission, uh, they're doing the same thing. I suspect the U.S. naval commanders on the ocean there, on the sea there, would say that it might be a little easier, it might be a little bit more efficient if they were all under one clear chain of command, but they're making it work. And the French are specifically, I think there's some, your listeners may want to do a search. There's some amazing video of not just American, but French assets intercepting Houthi drone attacks and other attacks on the Red Sea. They're right in the middle of the fight, and they're doing their doing their part. I would submit to defend international shipping. That's all, by the way, the coalition is wanting to do on the Red Sea is ensure the free passage of international shipping through this very vital waterway. I
Yes,
think
so
we
you
we
answered
call it.
my question right there because I was using with our senior analysts a lot on why this shouldn't be national. It's
Mhm.
an international
Right.
through the Red Sea. But they're out there.
They are there,
They're
and
helping us.
there's it's not just the French, it's not just the Brits. I think the Danes have assets there. I think the Spanish and the Italians too. So it is a coalition. And then look at those countries, count them up. They're all members of NATO,
Yes.
and that's years and years, decades of what the your so many of your listeners are military veterans. They call interoperability, basically a big term for practicing working together. And decades of that help NATO members on the seas and the skies, and certainly on the ground, sometimes in space too, cooperate and work together. And sometimes it's kinetic operations, sometimes it's defensive, sometimes it's humanitarian. But right now on the Red Sea, it's very kinetic. And it does look like some of the traffic through the Red Sea is increasing, which is good. But these Houthi attacks are really a threat, as you said, to
Yeah.
international shipping. And our European allies are working with us.
Yes, because
I'm sure
certainly
it could
they are
be more
receiving a
effective.
lot.
Right.
Yes. I was interested to see it was Britain, which we knew, Bahrain, Canada, France, Italy, the Netherlands, Norway, the
There you
state
go.
Chiles, if I'm saying that correctly, and Spain.
So several countries and a couple that aren't members of NATO too there, which is truly an international partnership, which what you need in that case. And I understand, I think the typical American, the average American, President Trump's message of uh, we're bearing a bigger share of the burden than everybody else, that resonates, and I understand that. Uh, but one thing Americans need to remember is we bear a bigger share than other countries, largely because we're just bigger. Oh, it's not fair, really, to compare the United States and France, or the United States and Britain, or the United States and Italy. The United States and EU, you can compare, population-wise, demographics, economics, et cetera. But just comparing us country to country, we're big, and I don't think Americans appreciate that. By the way, bigness, and I know this isn't really about China, but China's always in the background of your
Yes.
wonderful interviews, Joy. We're small compared to China, so we need the Europeans to be partners in containing and deterring China, because without them, China is a country of 1.3 billion. We're a country of 340 million. China's economy is coming close to ours, and China's navy is bigger than ours
Yes.
already, et cetera, et cetera. Its missile force is getting bigger. But when we combine American and European and Japanese, South Korean, Aussie, Philippine, other free world allies together, then we're able to match and deter and contain China. We really need them, our allies, not just in Europe, but also in the Indo-Pacific.
And that's a good point you brought up because sometimes I don't agree. Well, always agree with any administration, right? Completely, but
No, right.
I think Trump's not too off on having more for NATO
Right.
deterrence and defense.
No, it's not. But by the way, that's a great point, Joy. And I don't know if I mentioned that column. Again, I wish I had, but that's a very good. I know I have in other my columns for F, but the president is correct to say NATO partners, you need to raise your GDP. NATO's been, the official NATO guideline or standard is 2% of GDP. Uh, Several countries are above that now. Uh, President Trump wasn't the first to do that. You go back, it's been decades. One of the strongest criticisms, if you go back and look at Secretary Gates, who was defense secretary under Bush 43 and Obama, very sharp and stinging at times with the Europeans. Other secretaries of defense since then were saying we're really getting to a two-tiered alliance. President Trump isn't outside the mainstream or outside the consensus on that. I think how he says things is a little bit, you know, tough sometimes, but I think it's having an impact. NATO Secretary Generals, the last two have said President Trump's challenge to European allies, the NATO allies, has triggered them to raise their defense spending. So it's having an impact. By the way, I think Vladimir Putin's having an impact too. So I don't think it's
Yes, and I'm
you know
going to get to
President
him too in a
President
minute.
Trump likes to take credit for everything, but I think Vladimir Putin has probably a bigger impact on our NATO allies raising their defense spending.
So and I want to get your thoughts on this because I was posing this question, talking to our senior offline about why the U.S. and our other allies don't utilize our Djibouti military base for this Houthi war in the Red Sea there of strikes.
I don't know. It's a good question. You gave me a curveball there. Usually I'm able to answer. I don't know. It's possible. I haven't looked into this. I can check, uh, obviously after the interview, but it's possible that Djibouti says you cannot launch offensive operations from our territory. Host countries have the right to do that. So that's a possibility. It certainly is close geographically to the, that Horn of Africa is very close to the Arabian Peninsula. So I don't know. I don't know if there isn't any kind of support or logistical, uh, symbiosis there. I don't know, but it's possible that the Djiboutis have said you can't use this. But I can't say I'm fully aware of that one. It's a good question.
That would make the most sense, though. What you're saying, they're against that. But
Right.
I would certainly think that was close enough for our fighter jets, no problem. I
Right.
believe most of our drones do have capability that kind of distance.
Long range for sure.
Yeah.
That's right. And we've lost quite a few, as you probably know. The Houthi air defenses have been pretty effective at hitting. I think we've lost 7 of our attack UCAVs, unmanned combat area vehicles. They fly slow, so we haven't had issues with our manned aircraft, which are much faster. But they've hit 7 of those, I think,
Yes.
UCAVs, and I think most of those are. I don't know if they're coming from Djibouti or not. I suspect they're coming from bases around the Arabian Peninsula. Maybe Jordan, maybe could be Saudi, could be Israel.
Bahrain, I believe.
Yep.
And so then I want to get to what you were talking about.
But by the way,
Go ahead.
that just your listeners probably have gotten there quicker than I. But that just is it further underscores the importance of allies. We can't launch these kinds of operations without bases to launch them from. Everything cannot emanate from the continental U.S. So you need allies just to be able to conduct and sustain these operations, which has to be emphasized. Yes, they happen to help other parts of the world, but they do serve U.S. interests primarily. America's interests, going back to the Jefferson administration, America has always been committed to freedom of navigation because we've always been a trading nation. I mean, Jefferson went to war over it against the Barbary states. That was about freedom of navigation. And so we do this. We try to keep the sea lanes open in the Red Sea, South China Sea, elsewhere, because we believe in freedom of navigation, because that's part of sustaining the free flow of trade.
And I'm glad you brought up the South China Sea. They were not pulling back everywhere because I understand we are building up in the Philippines.
Right, right. And the Philippines, they've had a real reversal since Duterte left, and a real return to serious commitment to alliance relations with the United States, building a new alliance with Japan, uh, working with the Aussies and the French. For the first time in history, I think just recently, French aircraft landed, military aircraft, fighter combat jets, Philippine territory. And I think right now they're hosting a massive exercise involving dozens or over a dozen free world allies. They're serious. The Philippines are serious about deterring China. They just landed some Marines, some Philippine Marines on a Philippine set of islets that the Chinese claim. They've taken China to court, by the way, and they've
Yes,
won in
yes.
international court. So they're serious and they're committed. They're building up their patrol craft. I think they've just bought some F-16s, which is really going to upgrade their capabilities in the air. They've opened up 9 bases to America. As you and your listeners know, all of us who are children of the Cold War know, that was a major, air and naval facility for the United States throughout the Cold War. That changed at the end of the Cold War. They said leave, and America left. Now they're saying come back, and we are
No.
working with them.
Well, certainly China is giving them quite a bullying over there in the South.
That's right. Nothing brings countries together like a common enemy, right?
That's very well put. And speaking of common enemy, so I wanted to get to the Trump and Putin situation, as you wrote about in your article. And you stated that Putin isn't interested in peace, and I would agree. But I think he is interested in the U.S. removing sanctions.
Yes.
So, Alan, I was wondering, do you think the Trump administration could be looking at a bigger picture when dealing with Putin? And I'm talking from easing sanctions on Russia wouldn't give them an excuse to economically have to partner with China and Iran or North Korea, be more choosing.
Right. Well, the advocates and those who have defended Trump's policy in the second administration, Trump foreign policy, say and have made the case, thoughtful people, that there's a chance here, and it's perhaps Trump is trying to play a longer game. Uh, People say the term two-dimensional, three-dimensional chess, that he's trying to drive a wedge, trying to pull Putin's Russia away from China and closer to the U.S. And the way to do that is to settle this Ukraine war as quickly as possible, get it, stop the hot war aspect of it, get it, cool it down, and then start to build, or I guess you could say rebuild relations with Russia. That's possible. I don't think it's going to be fruitful. That may be possible that that's what President Trump and Secretary Rubio and National Security Advisor Waltz are hoping or thinking. But I don't think they should put much stock in Putin being a good partner in that regard. There's just the history of the last 25 years points in the opposite direction with Putin. I think people overstate when they compare him to Hitler. I think that's too much. But I do think he does want to expand his power, expand his sphere of influence. I think Ukraine is an example of that. Georgia is an example of that. Moldova is an example of that. Things he says and does in relation to the Baltics and the Poles, I think, are an example of that. So I don't think those things will change even after we could get to a Ukraine war settlement. I think Putin's Russia is an adversary. I think that's what it is. I don't know if there's much we can do to peel them away, but I know that people of goodwill want to do that and think they can do that. And
yeah, it's the only angle I could see that works.
Right, and and if that's possible, that would be great. I just don't think that's possible. think that
I know.
we don't we talked about vision and values a moment ago, Joy. We don't share Putin's values for certain, and our interests don't overlap really very
No.
much either. If you just look at what he's done and said the last 25 years, and by the way, several administrations have mishandled the Russia relationship the last 25 years. It's not just Trump. And by the way, that to me means that Putin's the problem. We've had very different presidents from 2000 until today. That captures Bill Clinton all the way to Donald Trump. Very different approaches and different ways of trying to deal with him. And all of them really have ended up about the same place. And that means to me that it's Putin's the problem.
We know he doesn't want NATO right on his front door, but I don't see that not happening.
He doesn't want NATO on his front door, like really almost every Russian leader, really except Yeltsin and Gorbachev, which is odd, the last leader of the Soviet Union. He, like all the Soviet leaders before Gorbachev, wants there not to be a NATO. Wants NATO to cease to exist. Not just not have Ukraine in NATO, but there not to be a NATO. Interesting if you go back and look at the history. George H.W. Bush writes about this. Gorbachev actually thought as the Cold War came to the end, NATO was very important to keeping Europe stable, and of course it was in the post-Cold War era. Still is today, but Putin doesn't want there to be a NATO.
Yes. Well, he has stated there'll be a 24-hour ceasefire next. How that plays out.
Wouldn't hold your breath, he's had a, yeah, I know you're a serious and realistic person, he's had ceasefires over the last several months, and he's broken them, or his men have broken them.
Yes.
And the Ukrainians haven't. The international observers, those monitoring these things, have kind of tracked these fires, and they have been broken by the Russians. So I'll be surprised if anything comes of that.
I agree. And so getting to our peace through strength strategy, I always like to bring the U.S. global leadership, like I said, is force for peace, democracy, and rights. It appears to me that the world is starting to see us kind of moving away, as we discussed, moving away from that global leadership.
Yes, and that's worrisome. I mean, I think it's the historian Bob Kagan had a great insight about 15 years ago in one of his books. He said that throughout modern history, and he defines modern in hundreds of years, the world generally reflects the characteristics of its greatest power of that time. And so he kind of delineates that. He marches through time and makes the case it's pretty compelling. And in the post-World War II era, it has reflected generally the broad contours of how America views individual liberty, how America views free markets, free trade, how America views the need for nations to work together and cooperate. Basically, the post-Cold War order, as some call it, reflects the values of the United States. So if America, and his point is, when history shows when that particular power starts to pull back or starts to collapse, the power that replaces it, the world will start to reflect or the contours of its values and its vision. So if America is in the midst of that kind of a period of turning inward, we can't guarantee that we'll be able to, the world will be the same when we want to be engaged again. The concern to me is the countries that share our values don't have the muscle to do what we do alone. And the countries that have the muscle to determine an international order don't share our values, right? Yes. So I think it's a no-brainer that we need to be engaged in the world. We shouldn't pull back. We need to work with our allies, not browbeat them or kind of humiliate them in some cases. Right. In the case of Canada, that it truly doesn't make any sense to me. I understand calling the Europeans to task. Some of these nations in Europe are spending, very little on defense, do very little on defense. Canada is a good friend, a good ally, our best trading partner. We have this massive peaceful border, and treating them the way we've treated them is very hard for me to understand. So,
Yeah, and you
uh,
make good points in your about how much Canada has support.
yes, I mean, in every major crisis, those uh, the Canadians have been with us. Now, I think they can do more on defense, but all of many of your listeners and supporters uh, were in the service, and many of them know how important NORAD has been to American security, both in the Cold War and after the Cold War. That's a U.S. Canada really unprecedented, nothing like it on Earth. This joint, almost melded military partnership, more than a partnership, it's melded really. So I just think we need to treat our allies like friends, tell them, I think the old phrase, praise in public, criticize in private
Mm.
would apply, and I think that would get a lot more traction. I think if we did that, but we need them. They certainly need us. They know they need us, and
Yeah.
that's why they're in. So many of them are rattled right now.
I think when we talked last time, we were about the EU but wanted to try to make some alliance with Ukraine, but really need backing
Yes,
telecommunication intel.
they have to be. They said they've been very clear. The Brits and the French are building a coalition of the willing to be for lack of a better term, a peacekeeping force on day one when the guns fall silent. They've said we'll lead it, we'll man it, but we need a backstop support from the United States. And there's examples through history of that happening, but they need that assurance that the Americans will be there as that backstop. And I think that will be in our interest because uh, a hot war in the middle of Europe is not good for anyone. And that's where President Trump is correct. He wants this war to end. I think he's treated the one of the concerns I have with his view of the Ukraine Russia conflict is that he sees either as no one to blame or both are to blame, and I just think that that's a fundamentally wrong way to look at this. And if you look at it that way, you're going to get to maybe the wrong endpoint, But Europeans need the Brits and the French, who are our close friends, need that assurance from the United States that we'll be a backstop. They don't have that right now.
Yes, well, hopefully he can manage our allies
Yes.
and are in NATO engaged and rub them wrong. But I do think that there can be a balance where he bring back some manufacturing to the United States and rely on our allies
Right.
while kind of
Well,
decoupling from China what we don't want them to have us be able to
that's
squeeze
right.
us on.
It's something that country we've been talking about before Trump even, and now it's being accelerated. But it's something that can't happen overnight. And it seems to me it makes the case if you do want to decouple, like you mentioned, from China, especially on some industrial issues related, especially to defense. Uh, all the more you need to work with the allies that you trust in Japan and South Korea and in Europe, and we're making it hard for them to work with us when we do some of the things we've done on the tariff front and otherwise over the last.
Well, hopefully we'll see how things play out, and maybe that can be a balance there. He can see it for our allies.
Hope so too. Hope so too. There's plenty of opportunities for correctives or corrections, mid-course corrections, and hopefully that is beginning to happen.
Well, thank you, Alan, for joining us today.
Good to be here, Joy, as always.
Appreciate your paper and hope our listeners will our website, check out your latest article, and you've got a new one coming out in the next couple of days.
That's right. That'll be to you tomorrow.
All right, sounds good. Again, and to our listeners, please subscribe, comment, and share on our YouTube and channels. Let us know your thoughts on the U.S. line as a global leader and if the U.S. should stay in NATO and rely on our allies, if there can be a balance here between making America great again and our allies. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Substack. So thank you to everyone, and join us again next time for our podcast